The courtroom was packed to capacity, a suffocating tension hanging thick in the air. Spectators jostled for space in the narrow wooden benches, their whispers mixing with the frantic scribbles of journalists desperate to capture every moment. This was more than just a trial. It was a spectacle, an event already shaped by biases and assumptions before the first word was spoken. In the eye of the storm sat Jonathan Ellis, his shoulders squared and his gaze fixed straight ahead. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit he bought from a second-hand store, he adjusted his tie with the precision of a man determined not to falter. Jonathan was not a lawyer. He held no law degree, nor did he have years of courtroom experience to draw upon. But what he did have was knowledge far more valuable than the polished degrees hanging on the walls of those who sought to see him buried. Judge Richard Calloway peered down from his high perch, eyes gleaming with what looked dangerously close to amusement. The judge's reputation was well known. A man with little patience for nonsense, and even less tolerance for what he called arrogant displays of bravado. And yet, as he looked at Jonathan, there was something almost gleeful in his gaze, as if the whole proceeding was nothing more than an elaborate joke. "Mr. Ellis," Judge Calloway's voice cut through the murmurs, low and dismissive, "I assume you understand the risks of representing yourself in a case of this magnitude." Jonathan's chin lifted. His eyes, clear and unwavering, met the judge's with a calm intensity that seemed out of place in a room designed to break men like him. "I do, Your Honor." A dry chuckle escaped the judge's lips. "Very well. I admire your courage, if not your judgment. Proceed." To Jonathan's left, the prosecution table radiated smug confidence. Adam Grayson, the assistant district attorney, exchanged smirks with his co-counsel, his eyes glinting with condescension. They had been prepared to battle high-profile defense attorneys, experts in their field who could drag the case out for months. Instead, they were given a man who dared to defend himself with nothing but his words and his wits. It was laughable, or so they thought. The charges against Jonathan were nothing short of devastating. Embezzlement, fraud, money laundering. Words that spelled the end of careers, reputations, and sometimes lives. Jonathan had been a mid-level financial consultant at Wilson Harrington, one of the most influential investment firms in Phoenix. He had built his career with grit, dedication, and an obsessive attention to detail. Everything he had achieved had been through sheer determination and hard work. But none of that seemed to matter now. Not when nearly $500,000 had been siphoned from company accounts, all pointing directly back to him. His name had been splashed across the news, his image tarnished before he had even stepped into the courtroom. Friends turned their backs, colleagues whispered behind closed doors, and his own boss, Franklin Dorsey, made it his mission to throw him under the bus. "Mr. Ellis," Judge Calloway continued, his fingers drumming idly against the bench, "you do realize the severity of the charges against you, yes? The prosecution claims they have overwhelming evidence, and yet you've chosen to represent yourself. Am I correct in assuming you have a law degree I am somehow unaware of?" The prosecution's table erupted in stifled laughter, their amusement bubbling over like some cruel inside joke. Even some of the jurors shifted in their seats, their expressions a mixture of pity and disbelief. Jonathan didn't flinch. His voice was even, his gaze unyielding. "No, Your Honor, I don't have a law degree. But I do have something far more valuable. I have the truth." The laughter died down, but the mockery remained. Grayson's smile twisted into a sneer, his eyes practically daring Jonathan to try and defend himself. The case was supposed to be open and shut, the evidence supposedly airtight. Reports indicated fraudulent wire transfers made from Jonathan's work computer. Unexplained deposits had been traced to an offshore account, linked to his social security number. Every detail had been meticulously arranged to paint him as the perfect criminal. And yet, Jonathan remained composed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He had spent months preparing for this moment, poring over legal texts, memorizing case studies, and studying the very system designed to crush him. It was a desperate gamble, but he had nothing left to lose. "Very well," Judge Calloway said, the smirk still tugging at the edge of his mouth. "The state of Arizona versus Jonathan Ellis. Prosecution, you may begin." Grayson rose from his chair with the arrogance of a man who believed the battle was already won. His voice boomed through the room as he called his first witness, a former colleague of Jonathan's who spoke with the ease of someone thoroughly rehearsed. Words of condemnation flowed freely, each statement meticulously designed to bury Jonathan deeper under the mountain of accusations. Jonathan listened intently, his face unreadable. He knew the truth, but the truth alone wasn't enough. He would have to present it in a way that would make them listen. And that meant enduring every false statement, every twisted fact, until it was his turn to speak. The prosecution calls Franklin Dorsey to the stand. The bailiff's voice echoed across the room, cutting through the stagnant air. Jonathan's gaze hardened. Franklin Dorsey, the man who had once called him an invaluable asset to the company, now looked at him like a disease to be eradicated. Dorsey's suit was immaculate, his smile polished and fake as he took the stand. Jonathan braced himself. He knew this was coming. Dorsey had made it clear from the moment the investigation began that Jonathan would be the one to take the fall. He had power, influence, and the loyalty of men who valued their paychecks over the truth. But what Dorsey didn't know was that Jonathan had come prepared. Every sleepless night, every moment spent dissecting the evidence against him had led to this point. He wasn't just here to defend himself. He was here to expose the truth. And the truth would be far more devastating than anything they could imagine. The courtroom's oppressive silence thickened as Franklin Dorsey settled into the witness stand. His polished smile was designed to inspire confidence, but Jonathan saw it for what it was, veneer-hiding rot. The man who had once sung his praises as the firm's most dedicated and reliable consultant now stared down at him as though Jonathan were nothing more than a stain to be scrubbed clean. "State your name and occupation for the record," Adam Grayson intoned, his voice dripping with the arrogance of someone who had already declared victory. "Franklin Dorsey," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Wilson Harrington. And in your professional capacity, Mr. Dorsey, were you familiar with the defendant, Jonathan Ellis?" Grayson asked, as if the answer weren't already glaringly obvious. "Yes," Dorsey replied, nodding solemnly. "Jonathan was one of our mid-level financial consultants. He had access to high-profile accounts and performed well, until the discrepancies were discovered." "Discrepancies?" Grayson echoed, his gaze shifting toward the jury as though emphasizing the word's gravity. "Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?" "Certainly," Dorsey said, eyes flashing with feigned sorrow. "It was discovered that nearly $500,000 had gone missing from various investment accounts. The transactions were traced back to Mr. Ellis's work computer. Records showed unauthorized wire transfers to offshore accounts connected to his Social Security number." Jonathan could feel the eyes of the jurors boring into him. Their expressions shifted from mild curiosity to outright suspicion. Dorsey's words were like chains, binding him tighter to the narrative they all wanted to believe. The narrative of a thief who abused his position and betrayed the very company that had placed its trust in him. "I see," Grayson said, pretending to sound impartial. "And when this discrepancy was brought to Mr. Ellis's attention, how did he respond?" "He denied everything," Dorsey said with a tired shake of his head. "Claimed he was being set up, that someone was framing him. But the evidence was clear. I mean, everything pointed back to him." Jonathan's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. He'd seen this performance before, had anticipated every lie and half-truth that would be spewed from Dorsey's mouth. The man was a master manipulator, skilled at constructing facades that even the sharpest minds would struggle to dismantle. Grayson nodded, his face a picture of theatrical concern. "Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. Your testimony has been most enlightening." He turned back to the judge with a satisfied smile. "No further questions at this time, Your Honor." Judge Calloway glanced down at Jonathan, the amusement still gleaming in his eyes. Mr. Ellis, your witness. Jonathan rose to his feet, his body rigid yet controlled. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, the moment where his voice had to cut through the smokescreen of deception. He approached the stand, his gaze never leaving Dorsey's. "Mr. Dorsey," Jonathan began, his tone measured and calm. "You mentioned that the unauthorized transactions were traced to my work computer. Could you clarify what measures the company has in place to ensure the security of those computers?" Dorsey's brow furrowed slightly. "We use top-of-the-line firewalls, encrypted passwords, and biometric scanning to prevent unauthorized access. So you're saying it would be extremely difficult for someone other than myself to access my workstation, correct?" Jonathan pressed. "Difficult, but not impossible," Dorsey replied. "No system is flawless." Jonathan allowed the words to hang in the air for a moment. "Interesting. And when these alleged transactions occurred, were there any other employees who had access to my office or workstation?" Dorsey hesitated. "Your office was located within the secured floors of the firm. Only employees with proper clearance would have access to that area. So, in theory, anyone with the proper clearance could potentially access my computer if they had the means to bypass security, correct?" "Yes, but that would be highly improbable," Dorsey said, his voice tightening. "Improbable, but not impossible," Jonathan replied smoothly. "Now let's talk about the offshore accounts these transactions were allegedly sent to. You claim they were linked to my social security number. Do you have documented proof showing my direct involvement in opening those accounts?" Dorsey's mouth opened and closed, his polished demeanor slipping ever so slightly. "The investigators, they found connections, trails that led back to you. Yes or no, Mr. Dorsey?" Jonathan's voice rose just enough to make the entire courtroom still. "Do you have documented proof that I personally opened those accounts?" "No," Dorsey admitted through gritted teeth. "Then how do you explain the deposits made to those accounts?" Jonathan continued, his intensity increasing with each word. "Deposits that, might I add, were made using wire transfers authorized by systems I didn't even have clearance to access." Dorsey's face drained of color, the composed facade fracturing beneath the weight of Jonathan's accusations. The silence in the courtroom was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of papers and the shifting of uncomfortable jurors in their seats. Grayson's voice sliced through the tension. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is badgering the witness." "Overruled," Judge Calloway replied, his tone more measured now, his interest piqued by Jonathan's line of questioning. "I'd like to hear the answer." Jonathan took a step closer, his gaze still locked on Dorsey. "You framed me, didn't you?" The man's eyes flared with something like panic before his arrogance reasserted itself. I did no such thing. Yet you can't provide any tangible proof that I committed these crimes, only circumstantial evidence conveniently pointing in my direction. Evidence you had a hand in collecting, if I'm not mistaken." Dorsey's composure was beginning to fracture, his shoulders twitching with barely contained agitation. "This is absurd." "What's absurd?" Jonathan countered, his voice cutting like a knife, "is that the truth has been twisted beyond recognition. But I'm here to untangle it, and I have evidence that will do just that." The spectators leaned forward, journalists' pens frozen in midair. Even Judge Calloway's fingers ceased their impatient drumming. "Evidence," the judge echoed, his voice stripped of its previous condescension. "Mr. Ellis, are you claiming you have evidence that refutes the prosecution's case?" Jonathan met his gaze with unflinching certainty. "Yes, Your Honor. And when I present it, there won't be a shadow of doubt left in this room." The air in the courtroom had grown so thick with tension, it felt like every breath was a battle. Jonathan remained standing, his gaze steady, his mind sharper than ever. This was his chance, his only chance, to prove his innocence, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. Judge Calloway's expression had shifted from mockery to something resembling curiosity. His eyes narrowed slightly as if, for the first time, he was truly paying attention to the man standing before him. "You say you have evidence, Mr. Ellis, The judge's voice echoed through the silent room. "Then by all means, present it." Jonathan nodded, his calm demeanor masking the storm raging within him. He reached for a folder resting on the defendant's table and opened it slowly, his movements deliberate, commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "The prosecution has relied heavily on the idea that I was the only individual with access to the compromised accounts," Jonathan began. "But as Mr. Dorsey himself admitted, the security systems within Wilson Harrington are not infallible. And more importantly, Mr. Dorsey's own clearance grants him full access to all workstations under his supervision, including mine." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Dorsey shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident veneer slipping by the second. Grayson rose from his chair, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Objection. This is pure speculation." "Overruled," Judge Calloway interjected, his gaze still locked on Jonathan. "Continue." "Thank you, Your Honor." Jonathan glanced briefly at Grayson before turning his attention back to the jury. "Now I will admit, the evidence gathered against me appears, on the surface, to be compelling. But when you dig deeper, you start to see the cracks." He flipped through the pages of his folder before pulling out a printed document. "This is a forensic analysis of the wire transfers conducted from my workstation. The timestamps are critical because they show that these transactions occurred during hours when I was not physically present at the firm." Jonathan handed copies of the document to the bailiff, who distributed them to the judge, the jury, and the prosecution's table. Grayson snatched his copy with barely concealed annoyance, his eyes scanning the page with increasing alarm. "How did you obtain this?" Grayson demanded. "The same way the prosecution gathered their so-called evidence," Jonathan replied coolly. "By hiring experts who actually know how to do their jobs properly." More murmurs. Even the journalists seemed momentarily stunned, their pens scratching furiously against notepads as they struggled to keep up with the unfolding drama. Jonathan's voice grew steadier, more forceful. "But it doesn't end there. The IP addresses associated with the transfers were traced back to a remote server located offsite, a server conveniently rented under a shell company." He held up another document. "And who happens to be the registered owner of that shell company?" "Mr. Franklin Dorsey himself." Gasps erupted from the spectators. Dorsey's face had gone ashen, his hands clutching the edge of the witness stand like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. This is absurd," Dorsey sputtered, his voice now high-pitched and trembling. "Those documents are fabricated, a desperate attempt to cast blame where it doesn't belong." "Oh, they're genuine, Mr. Dorsey, verified by multiple independent analysts, and as you well know, they will hold up under any scrutiny," Jonathan replied, his eyes never leaving Dorsey's face. Grayson's composure had crumbled, his confidence eroded by the sheer force of Jonathan's evidence. But Jonathan wasn't done. "Not yet. Let's not forget the offshore accounts you mentioned," Jonathan continued. "The accounts supposedly linked to my Social Security number. I took the liberty of hiring a private investigator to look into those accounts. And what do you know? The funds deposited into them originated from your own personal accounts, Mr. Dorsey." More gasps. Even the judge's eyes widened. Dorsey's lips quivered, his mind clearly racing to formulate some sort of rebuttal. But Jonathan had already buried him. "The accounts were registered under a name eerily similar to mine, but with just enough discrepancies to cast suspicion my way. It's a classic tactic. Create a paper trail so tangled, it's nearly impossible to untangle." Nearly impossible. Jonathan's words hung in the air like a knife poised to strike. The jurors looked stunned, their expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. And all of that anger was now directed at Dorsey. Dorsey stammered. "This is a misunderstanding. There must be some kind of mistake." "The only mistake," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "was underestimating me." A pause, a beat of silence so profound it felt as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. And then Jonathan delivered the final blow. Your Honor, I request a full audit of Mr. Dorsey's financial records and a thorough investigation into his dealings with the accounts in question. And until that investigation is completed, I move that all charges against me be dismissed due to lack of credible evidence. Judge Calloway's eyes had narrowed, his earlier amusement replaced by something far more serious. For the first time, he looked at Jonathan not as a man desperately clinging to hope, but as someone who had laid the foundation for a powerful case. "Mr. Grayson," the judge said, his voice heavy with authority, "would you care to respond?" Grayson's mouth opened and closed uselessly. His polished confidence had shattered beneath the weight of Jonathan's meticulously crafted defense. It was clear to everyone in the room that he had nothing of substance left to offer. "Your Honor, I need time to review this new evidence," Grayson said, his voice quivering. "Granted," Judge Calloway said, "but I suggest you make it quick. This trial has taken a most unexpected turn." Jonathan returned to his seat, his posture calm but his mind still racing. He had dealt a brutal blow to his accusers, but he knew it was far from over. The system wasn't about to bow to him just because he had rattled its pillars. No, if anything, they would come after him even harder. But Jonathan was ready, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to stop him from proving his innocence. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Even the buzzing of fluorescent lights seemed to have stilled, leaving only the rustle of papers and the occasional creak of the jury's chairs. Jonathan could feel the tide turning, but he wasn't foolish enough to think it was over. Not yet. He had just dismantled the prosecution's case with hard evidence and relentless focus, but there was still one more thread to pull, one that would unravel the entire scheme Dorsey and his allies had woven around him. Jonathan knew they would try to dismiss his evidence as some sort of desperate attempt to redirect blame. The prosecution's silence was only the calm before a vicious storm. "Your Honor," Grayson's voice came, finally regaining some of its polished arrogance, though the cracks were visible. "We would request a recess to properly review this unexpected evidence Mr. Ellis has presented." Jonathan's gaze remained steady, eyes locked on Judge Calloway. He could see the man's mind working, calculations running wild as he weighed the validity of Jonathan's evidence against the prosecution's dwindling credibility. "Very well," Judge Calloway said at last, though his voice sounded wearier than before. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. Mr. Ellis, Mr. Grayson, I expect both of you to be fully prepared." Dismissed. The judge's gavel came down with a crisp crack, and the gallery erupted into frantic murmurs. Journalists scrambled to capture the latest twist, their eyes darting between Jonathan and Dorsey like vultures circling a carcass. As the bailiff escorted him out, Jonathan caught sight of Dorsey's face, his cheeks flushed, his eyes seething with the kind of rage only exposed guilt could provoke. The man was already plotting, already scheming. But Jonathan had the upper hand now, and he wasn't about to give it up. He made his way out of the courthouse, his mind replaying the events of the day. The evidence he presented was solid, but it wouldn't be enough. Not yet. Dorsey had powerful connections, people who wouldn't hesitate to bury the truth if it meant protecting their own interests. As Jonathan walked down the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. The name flashing on the screen made his heart skip a beat. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with both relief and dread. "Jonathan, I've been following the trial." Sarah's voice came through, steady and strong, the voice of a woman who had once been his closest friend and confidant. They had drifted apart over the years, life pulling them in different directions. But if anyone knew the truth about him, it was Sarah. "You've got them on the ropes." "Maybe, but they'll come back swinging tomorrow. I know Dorsey, and he won't go down without a fight. I've been doing some digging of my own," Sarah continued. "You're right about Dorsey, but he's not the only one pulling strings. There's someone else. Someone higher up." Jonathan's jaw clenched. Who? The real mastermind behind this entire setup. Dorsey's just a pawn. I found evidence linking him to a private security firm that specializes in corporate sabotage. And the firm's CEO is. She paused, her hesitation palpable. Is who, Sarah? Marcus Henshaw. The name slammed into Jonathan's mind like a freight train. Marcus Henshaw was a billionaire mogul with interests in everything from real estate to technology. A man who had been practically untouchable for years. What the hell does Henshaw have to do with this? Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything. Dorsey was just following orders. Henshaw wanted you taken down because your financial analysis uncovered discrepancies in one of his largest acquisitions. Discrepancies that, if exposed, would cost him billions. Jonathan's mind raced. So, framing me for embezzlement was just a way to silence me. Exactly. And Dorsey was his tool to do it. But if you're going to take Henshaw down, you're going to need more than just the evidence you presented in court. You're going to need undeniable proof. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Do you have it? Not yet. But I'm close. I've found a whistleblower, someone who worked directly under Henshaw. They're willing to talk, but only if their identity remains protected. Jonathan took a deep breath, the weight of the conspiracy pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Can you arrange a meeting? I already have, Sarah replied. Tomorrow morning, before court. But Jonathan, be careful. Henshaw's people are already watching you. If they find out you're onto them, they won't hesitate to silence you permanently. Jonathan's grip on his phone tightened. Let them try. I'm not backing down. The call ended, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins refused to subside. Jonathan returned to his apartment that night, his mind a whirlwind of strategies, counter-arguments, and desperate hopes. The next morning, he arrived at the courthouse early. The meeting with the whistleblower had been brief but revealing. Everything Sarah had suspected was true, and more. He had spent the previous night gathering every piece of evidence he could find, including logs of suspicious financial transactions, confidential emails, and even voice recordings from the whistleblower implicating both Dorsey and Henshaw. It was a mountain of damning proof that would shatter the false narrative woven against him. As Jonathan stepped into the courthouse, the air felt different, heavy, charged. He could feel the stares of people who had once looked at him with pity now watching him with something close to awe. Even Judge Calloway seemed more alert, his gaze sharper, his posture rigid with anticipation. Grayson sat hunched at the prosecution's table, his face pale and drawn. And Dorsey looked like a man already sentenced to damnation. Jonathan took his seat and looked directly at Dorsey, his eyes cold, unyielding. Today was the day everything would change. The truth would be revealed, and those who had tried to destroy him would face the reckoning they so richly deserved. Jonathan's heartbeat pounded like a war drum as he took his place at the defense table. The weight of the documents he carried felt both reassuring and daunting, but he had no choice now. The truth had to come out. It was his only chance. Judge Calloway entered the courtroom, his gaze already trained on Jonathan, as if he sensed something was about to erupt. The room quieted almost instantly, the murmur of voices evaporating into tense silence. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced, his deep voice echoing throughout the chamber. Mr. Ellis, Judge Calloway said, folding his hands in front of him, are you prepared to proceed? Yes, Your Honor. Jonathan's voice was clear and firm. Gone was the uncertainty of the early days of the trial. What he held in his hands was more than evidence. It was a reckoning. Mr. Grayson, is the prosecution ready? Yes, Your Honor, Grayson replied, though his voice lacked the usual confidence. His eyes flickered over Jonathan, with a mixture of irritation and worry. He was starting to realize this wasn't the same man he had ridiculed before. Proceed, Mr. Ellis, the judge said. Jonathan stood, holding a slim black folder in his hands. Before I begin, I'd like to enter additional evidence into the record. Grayson immediately shot up from his chair. Objection, Your Honor. The defense cannot continuously introduce new evidence without proper notice. Ordinarily, you would be correct, Jonathan replied, unfazed. However, this evidence pertains to new findings that only recently became available to me, due to the interference of those attempting to obscure the truth. Calloway's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Ellis, you're walking a fine line. But I will allow you to proceed if this evidence proves relevant." Jonathan nodded and glanced briefly at Sarah, who sat near the back of the courtroom, her expression locked in fierce determination. Then he began. "The prosecution's case rests entirely on the claim that I embezzled nearly $500,000 from Wilson Harrington Investments. They claim that I was the only person with access to the accounts in question, and that the money was transferred to an offshore account in my name." Jonathan paused, allowing his words to settle over the room. The jury leaned in, caught between skepticism and curiosity. "But that's not true," Jonathan continued. "The funds were indeed transferred to an offshore account, but not by me." He opened the black folder and pulled out a series of documents, holding them up so the court could see. "These are transaction logs from the internal servers of Wilson Harrington Investments. They show a pattern of unauthorized access to my accounts from a remote IP address, one that doesn't belong to me." Judge Calloway frowned. "And you can prove this?" "Yes, Your Honor. The logs show access times that correspond to hours when I was documented elsewhere, working on-site with clients, attending company meetings, even sitting in traffic, as proven by time-stamped GPS records from my phone." Grayson's expression twisted into something ugly. Anyone could have forged those documents. This is nothing but a desperate attempt to manufacture reasonable doubt. Jonathan didn't even flinch. "I anticipated that argument, which is why I brought along a little more than just paperwork." He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a small device, a voice recorder. "This is a recording of a conversation I had this morning with a whistleblower who worked directly under Mr. Marcus Henshaw. The same Marcus Henshaw who, as you'll see in these emails, ordered Mr. Dorsey to frame me and plant false evidence to discredit my financial analysis of their acquisitions." Jonathan pressed play. The voice that poured from the speakers was raw and fearful. It detailed not only the orders given by Marcus Henshaw, but also how Dorsey had arranged to funnel the money through Jonathan's accounts and set him up as the perfect scapegoat. "Your Honor," Jonathan continued after the recording ended, "what you just heard was the testimony of someone who risked their own safety to expose the truth. I have further documentation to corroborate every claim made in that recording, including email chains, encrypted files, and testimonies from others willing to come forward." Judge Calloway's eyes widened, his composure visibly rattled. "Mr. Grayson, do you have a response?" Grayson's face was a storm of rage and panic. "This is absurd. Your Honor, these so-called testimonies are unverified. The defendant is trying to manipulate the court with unproven allegations." "They are not unproven," Jonathan replied. "In fact, I have here a direct line of communication to the FBI's Cybercrime Division. They have already launched an investigation into Marcus Henshaw and Mr. Dorsey's dealings, which, if the court would allow, I would be happy to present." Silence. Heavy. Inescapable. Judge Calloway's fingers drummed against the bench, his gaze locked on Jonathan. "You're telling me the FBI is involved?" "Yes, Your Honor. I contacted them the moment I discovered the full extent of the conspiracy, and from what I understand, arrests are imminent." Murmurs spread like wildfire through the gallery. The jurors exchanged glances, their expressions of doubt now transforming into concern. Even the reporters, who had once been so quick to paint Jonathan as a greedy criminal, were frantically scribbling down every word. Grayson's confidence had crumbled. His hand shook as he tried to piece together a coherent argument. This is a smear campaign. It's nothing but." "Mr. Grayson," Judge Calloway cut him off, his voice as cold as steel. "I will review all of the evidence Mr. Ellis has presented, and if what he claims is true, this case is about to take a very different turn." Jonathan met the judge's gaze head-on. "Thank you, Your Honor. I only seek the truth." Calloway nodded slowly. "Court is adjourned until further notice. Mr. Ellis, Mr. Grayson, I suggest you both prepare yourselves for what's coming next. The gavel slammed down, but the noise was barely heard over the chaos of reporters firing questions, spectators gasping, and the prosecution's legal team scrambling to salvage their broken case. Jonathan allowed himself one small breath of relief. It wasn't over yet, but the battle was no longer his alone. 2 days later, the courtroom was overflowing. Spectators crammed into the seats, reporters stood elbow to elbow in the back, and the air itself buzzed with anticipation. The world had heard the echoes of Jonathan's revelation, and everyone wanted to witness how the final act would unfold. Jonathan sat at the defense table, his expression calm but his eyes alert. He had barely slept since the last hearing, his mind replaying every detail of his presentation, every piece of evidence, every word he had spoken. This was his final shot at freedom. Judge Calloway entered with a tension in his step that wasn't there before. His gaze was hard, his mouth set in a line of grim determination. He was a man whose authority was now on shaky ground, and everyone in the room could sense it. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "Mr. Ellis," Judge Calloway said, his voice gruff, "you've made some heavy accusations. The court has taken the time to thoroughly review the evidence you presented, and I've also been contacted by the FBI to confirm their involvement." The murmurs among the audience grew louder. The FBI had acknowledged the case. That alone was enough to rattle everyone present, especially the prosecution. Grayson's usual confidence was gone. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from nights spent trying to salvage a crumbling case. He looked like a man being hunted. "Your Honor," Grayson began, his voice quivering, "I still contend that Mr. Ellis is attempting to mislead the court with falsified evidence and coerced testimonies." Jonathan rose from his seat. "With all due respect, Mr. Grayson, I find it interesting that the FBI has launched a formal investigation into Marcus Henshaw and Franklin Dorsey's dealings, and yet you continue to dismiss my claims. I would like to call a special witness to the stand." Grayson scoffed, but the look in his eyes betrayed his panic. "Your Honor, we were not informed of any new witnesses. This is highly irregular." Given the gravity of the situation, Judge Calloway said, his gaze never leaving Jonathan, "I will allow it, but Mr. Ellis, you had better make this worth the court's time." Jonathan nodded, his posture unshaken. "I call Agent Sarah Mathis to the stand." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sarah stood up from her seat near the back, her face composed, her stride confident. She wore a sleek, dark suit, the badge on her hip glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Agent Mathis, please state your name and occupation for the record," Jonathan said. "Special Agent Sarah Mathis, FBI Cybercrime Division." Grayson looked like he might be sick. His fingers clutched the edge of his table, as though he might fall off the world if he let go. "Agent Mathis," Jonathan continued, "can you confirm the existence of an ongoing investigation into Marcus Henshaw and Franklin Dorsey for financial crimes and conspiracy?" "Yes," Sarah replied with unwavering authority. "After reviewing the evidence provided by Mr. Ellis, our department launched a full-scale investigation. We have uncovered substantial proof of embezzlement, identity theft, and systematic efforts to frame Mr. Ellis for crimes he did not commit." The courtroom exploded with noise. Reporters were already halfway through their write-ups, their fingers clacking frantically against laptop keys. Judge Calloway's gavel slammed down hard. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." Once the noise settled, Jonathan continued, "Agent Mathis, are you prepared to present the findings of your investigation to this court?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said, her gaze fixed firmly on Judge Calloway. "I have here transcripts of recorded conversations implicating Mr. Henshaw and Mr. Dorsey in a conspiracy to frame Mr. Ellis. We also have documented evidence of financial transactions routed through accounts controlled by Mr. Henshaw, not Mr. Ellis." Grayson was practically shaking now. His entire career was on the verge of collapse, and the desperation in his eyes was unmistakable. "Your Honor," "This is outrageous," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "None of this has been properly vetted. This witness cannot be trusted." Sarah didn't even flinch. "You are free to call the FBI's Internal Affairs Office to verify my credentials, Mr. Grayson, and I assure you, they will confirm the validity of everything I have presented here today." Judge Calloway's eyes narrowed, his gaze darting from Sarah to Grayson, and then finally to Jonathan. The weight of the truth was undeniable now. "Mr. Grayson, unless you have any substantial counter-evidence to present, I am prepared to make my ruling." Grayson's mouth opened, but no words came out. His shoulders sagged, and the fight drained from his eyes. "Very well," Judge Calloway said, his voice low and unsteady. "Based on the overwhelming evidence presented by Mr. Ellis and confirmed by the FBI, I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against the defendant. Furthermore, I am ordering a formal investigation into the actions of Marcus Henshaw and Franklin Dorsey. This court will not tolerate corruption." The gavel slammed down, but this time it felt like a hammer striking away Jonathan's chains. The sound of applause erupted from the gallery, people cheering and shouting his name. Jonathan closed his eyes, the relief sweeping over him like a tidal wave. But as the adrenaline faded, he realized something more profound. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had been silenced, trampled on, framed, or punished for daring to stand up against the powerful. He shook Sarah's hand as they walked out of the courtroom, the air fresher and lighter than it had ever been. "Looks like your gamble paid off," Sarah said with a smile. "It was never a gamble," Jonathan replied. "It was a promise, to myself and to anyone else they tried to bury." As the doors swung open, a mass of reporters and spectators swarmed around him, their questions blaring in his ears. But above all the chaos, Jonathan felt something he hadn't known in a long time: freedom. And it tasted sweeter than anything he could have imagined.